Our next presenter, sort of unique here for the West Texas Symposium of History, is Jadon Montgomery. And currently, Jadon is an early college high school student here at Midland College. He's pursuing a major in mechanical engineering. He said he's kind of keeping his options open when it comes to a minor. I've heard him sort of say quietly he's thinking about history, so I'm just kidding, I made that part up. But he wants to graduate from ECHS and complete 2 more years at a university. And what Jadon's going to talk about today is going to talk about the history of maps of the Permian Basin. So please help me welcome Jadon Montgomery.
Okay, so like you said, my name is Jadon Montgomery, and today I'll be presenting to you the history of maps of the Permian Basin. So the maps of today are a very valuable asset that we use in our day-to-day lives, though map making not get to where it is overnight. Over thousands of years, map making has evolved through the building of concepts onto each other over time, like all things. For instance, a Native American in the Permian Basin in their time, whenever giving directions, would have likely told a fellow Native American to travel maybe this many sleeps in a direction that would have likely been in relation to the sun. Later, Europeans would come to the Americas and bring along with them their advances in map making to get a lay of the land, and this would be done through usage of boundary markers and other methods of measuring distance, such as the Gunter's chain. So, why bother with maps? Well, though map making used to be a much harder task back then in their time, the process of advancement had to happen in order for us to have the useful maps we have today. And that's why the development of maps have been so crucial. So, in the period of Spanish colonialism, map making ultimately relied on the observations of those out on expeditions throughout the Americas and other areas. And once these observations have been recorded, they will be either brought back to maybe a colony that was already established in the Americas, or even back to Europe to be processed into a map. And this map right here is an example of this concept. It was created by Jose Antonio de Alzate y Ramirez in 1768. And it was published in Paris and was made from a combination of sources that was brought from the expeditions throughout the Americas. And an interesting thing to note about this map is that it is the first printed map to apply the name Texas to a geographic region, which you'll be able to see right here, though it's very small. It says Provincia de los Texas. And what I did here was I put an overlay of Texas from a more accurate map in our time to compare the similarities and differences. And so what we're looking at here, whenever we look at the Rio Grande, they did a pretty good job at mapping the Rio Grande. But as we move further west, we can kind of tell that the details here and other areas start to get a bit messy. We are also able to get a good idea of where Midland is on this map because it has some form of a longitude and latitude system along the borders of this map. So moving on from there, in this period there were land agents known as empresarios who would obtain Spanish land grants of Texas. And to plot these land grants onto maps, the boundaries, land surveyors would go out and have to physically measure out the land first to be able to plot it. And this would generally be done through this tool known as the Gunter's chain, which was essentially an old version of the measuring tape. It acted as a way of measuring distance through multiple indicators provided right here, here, and here throughout the chain to act as a way of measuring distance. And the measurement employed during this time was known as the Mexican vara, which, according to the Texas Handbook, 1 Mexican vara is equal to 33 1/3 inches. So 5,645.4 square varas would be equal to 1 acre. Moving on from there, this map was created in 1833, 3 years before the Texas Revolution. It was created by someone named William Hooker. And as you can see here, it gets a little interesting when we're looking at the Texas Panhandle here. It's a lot short, it's a lot skinnier than it is in maps of today. We are also able to get a rough idea of where Midland is on this map because of the longitude and latitude grids on this one. And right east of that, we can see this little bit of text that says droves of wild cattle. The reason this was put there was likely because of the interest of cattle drives at this time. So an interesting thing related to cattle drives is that mesquite never actually grew in Texas originally. It was native from Mexico, and the reason that it got here was because of cattle drives. What would happen is the cattle would eat the mesquite seeds from down in Mexico, and as they went through cattle drives throughout Texas and other areas, they would eventually fully digest them and dispose of them along these trails. And what would happen is the seeds would be left behind to grow and then spread throughout all of Texas, and that's why we have all this mesquite here. Now, this map here was published in 1839, 3 years after the Texas Revolution, and it was made by someone named Gilman E., but would be published by R.S. Tanner in 1839. And the reason I included this map was because it shows a really good boundary line for the Republic of Texas, whenever it was its own independent nation at the time. And also it provides a really accurate longitude and latitude grid, so we were able to get a really good estimation of where Midland would be on this map. Moving on from there, this map was made by Carl Flemings, a German cartographer, and it was made in 1845, the same year that Texas would be annexed into the United States. And as we look at the top right of this map, we can see that there's a list which is all of the counties that were established at this time. And related to this topic is the concept of manifest destiny, which actually influenced the United States' decision in the first place to annex Texas. And through manifest destiny, we will see the counties here further develop westward along the later maps. So in West Texas, there were certain factors that came into the environment, as well as other things that created an added difficulty, but also certain conveniences that came to mapping and surveying West Texas. For instance, West Texas is a very hot and arid climate and environment in general, and because of this, it created an added difficulty whenever it came to mapping West Texas. However, Texas has a very flat terrain in the western portion of it, so because of that, it made it also a lot easier because there was very little change in height and there wasn't many steep slopes that you would have to encounter. That's what made it easier. But one thing that settlers as well as land surveyors would always have to worry about is having run-ins with Native Americans, which could escalate into violent conflicts between the two. So this map was made by James Hamilton in 1852, and if we look right here, there's a little bit of Texas's sandhills. Now these sandhills are likely alluding to the Monaghan Sandhills, which is just southwest of Midland, about 50 miles or so. And so moving on from here, we can see this map created in 1866 by a mapping company known as Schonberg. And in this map, we can see now a lot of the counties are starting to move west. Still, the Texas Panhandle, as well as the far western portion of Texas, is left undivided into just some big territories. But we'll see in later maps, these counties start to be fully established and become the counties in Texas state that we know of today. So here we can see on this map from 1833 that the Texas Panhandle is pretty much fully established in terms of counties. But this map was made by a mapping company known as Hardesty and Company. And one interesting thing to note about this map is that we can see the railroad that runs through Midland as well as this right here in Texas, created by the Texas Pacific Railroad Company at this time, fully mapped, and it shows it really well throughout this portion right here. And an interesting thing to note is that there's a bunch of towns that run along it, which acted as stations of sorts for the railroads and the trains running through there. And one of those towns is known as Midway, which would be later renamed as Midland and become this town we live in today. Now, the reason it was named Midway was because it acted as the midpoint between El Paso and Dallas. So then, of course, it would be later renamed as Midland and become the town that we're in today. So whenever Texas became a state in 1845, the counties of Texas were originally the land grants that the impresarios owned. But now, Texas has the most counties out of any state in America, an astounding 254. The reason this is because those governing Texas at the time thought it was necessary that these counties be a lot smaller so that those living in the counties could have a lot easier access to their local government and their county seat. And relating to this, Texas is a very large state in both landmass and population. And those factors combined would be the reason why Texas has so many counties compared to other states in the United States. On the topic of establishment of counties, Loving County is actually a really interesting story because it was actually established twice. So according to the Texas Handbook, what would happen is in 1883, 6 men from Denver, Colorado would go down to Loving County, which if you don't know where that is on this map, it is 2 counties west of Midland County, which is right here. Also another thing to note, we can see now Midway is now renamed Midland. So what the plan here was for these 6 men from Denver, Colorado, was to establish an irrigation company that would be known as the Loving Canal and Irrigation Company. And they planned to use the Pecos River that ran along one of the borders of Loving County to irrigate farmland throughout that area. And they planned to get farmers to come in there and purchase the land and make a profit out of it. So the thing is, they actually hired a lot of Mexican laborers to do most of the work, but then they would quit a few months later because they actually never paid any of their workers in the first place for that entire time. So then later after that, an interesting thing to note is that during this time around the 1890s for Loving County, there was only 3 residents actually, but it seemed as though they faked their numbers to make it seem like there was 150. And this was so that they could apply as their own separate county from one of the big territories that we saw earlier in some of the maps. And it actually worked. They became their own county, and Mentone, Texas would be the county seat of Loving County. However, this would cause farmers to move into this place because of the popularity likely. And then unfortunately, the Pecos River would flood in 1893, which caused the irrigation to flood and then ruined all the crops of the farmers that already moved there. So as a result, pretty much everyone started to leave again, and now the company was back at base 1. So after this, a company that was actually up from New York owned some land in Loving County. And what would happen is they would report an illegal organization of Loving County. An interesting thing apart related to this is that 4 of the 6 men from that irrigation company were actually put into high parts of the government. So you know they had to have done something down there in Loving County related to whatever happened. So 2 officials from the government would come down there and investigate Mentone, Texas, the county seat, and they find that there's only a couple houses and a little shopping market. And as they did some more investigation, they would actually find that not only were their elections illegitimate, there were only 3 residents, and on top of all of that, Loving County for the entire time it was established, they never paid any taxes whatsoever. And so no taxes were being collected whatsoever from Loving County. So as a result, the 2 officials decided to dissolve the county, and then Loving County would be reestablished later in 1930. So in 1903, the invention of the plane arose, and this would allow for a new form of land surveying known as aerial surveying or aerial photogrammetry, which is using a photograph like this from a very high area and using that perspective to draw that patch of land onto a map. And so though many took to the skies, I would like to focus on a man who was born in San Antonio, Texas, and would go on to create one of the biggest aerial mapping firms in the world, actually. And his name was Edgar Tobin. He was a fighter pilot in World War I and would go to establish the Edgar Tobin and Aerial Surveying Firm later after his time in World War I, and would do generally mapping for oil companies, according to the Texas Handbook. So not until the 1930s do we see Texas start to fully establish itself in terms of counties, and here we can see all the counties in Texas are established now. And after this, we don't see much change generally in terms of counties in Texas. and that's pretty much where the changes stop from here on. So, since we live in the Permian Basin, I would like to show as part of my presentation how the oil and gas industry relates to maps and things like that and surveying. So what I did was I interviewed Jeff Beard, a landman from Crown Quest Operating, about a few questions about land surveying in the field. So my first question was, how has the oil and gas industry influenced land surveying and map making in West Texas? And his reply was, to my knowledge, the oil and gas industry actually really didn't influence map making in West Texas because most of the land was already surveyed and mapped in West Texas in the time of it being established. And so this was done when the railroads were being built, and most all the surveys are named TNP RR Coast Survey, which this means the Texas Pacific Railroad Company that I had mentioned earlier. So pretty much all the tracks have been mapped around the 1880s according to Jeff Beard. So then my next question is, what are a couple of reasons for needing land surveys in the oil and gas industry? And Jeff Beard would reply that everything in oil and gas goes back to the map. We use mapping and surveying to spot all of our wells on the land that we own. And as a landman, anytime anybody asks me anything on our property, invariably the first question is, what is the land description? So the land description refers to the surveyed section number, town, and block. Once you have the land description, you can go back to a map and know exactly where people are talking about. So the map is the most important tool for the landman. And as my final question, I asked, what surveying techniques are currently used in the oil and gas industry? So he would reply that GPS is a large component of surveying today. And surveyors, whenever they do their field work, will generally use surveying to get GPS to get close to section corner lines. And then after this, they will physically dig, metal detect, and shoot corner lines to find metal pin corners. And once these corners are found, they'll tie them together onto a computer, and then after that, they will measure off footage calls for well bores. And now we're at the mapping of today. Maps are so useful now that we can even, like Jeff Beard said, use GPS to know exactly where you are on a map, and you can even input a location to know exactly how to get to that location. And you can even tell you how long it'll take to get there depending on your mode of transportation. And on top of all that, you always have one inside your pocket. And so my point is that throughout the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries, Texas cartographers have perfected the area, distance, and other important details in maps. And the difference is night and day when you compare 1700 maps to even 1800 maps. And my point is that if we did not put the time way back then and went through all the hard work to get to the advancements of today, we wouldn't have had the useful maps that we do today. Thank you.
Questions, comments for Jade?
Yes.
I guess I was driving once and using the phone map, what have you, and I guess there was bad reception and I got lost badly.
Yeah.
Oil fields around here. It was really worrisome. It was like after midnight. And are there ever any problems? Like you mentioned, you closed on the GPS and the electronics and what have you. Are there ever any problems that you know of with computer problems causing problems in interpretation and people's work?
Well, yeah, there's always going to be problems with any technology that we have nowadays, and all we can really do is try and find ways to get around it, which is what engineers and all sorts of people focus on doing, trying to figure out how to work around the problems and how to make it a lot more useful and applicable to everybody. Yes?
So, I love maps. I think the official term is a cartophile. I don't know. And so, this is a really silly question, but when you're looking at all these wonderful maps, is there one that was your favorite that you most enjoyed looking at, and why was it your favorite?
I liked looking at the very first map that I presented from 1768 because it just I used to like to draw maps when I was a kid, and you can just see that they're doing their best at trying to get a general idea of how that place looked, and they can use that as a map really well. And yeah, just part of that is kind of why I really like that map. Yes?
Yeah, all those really old maps are kind of screwy east-west because they didn't have any easy way to determine longitude.
Right. Yeah.
That's when the 19th century maps, they had that down where they knew how to use clocks to tell where they were on the surface of the earth. But in the 18th century, at the beginning, they didn't.
Right. Yes?
This might be a silly question. I'm from the Panhandle where the counties are all really square. So when you get south and it's kind of squiggly, is that rivers? Are they using rivers to establish county lines, or is that just random?
Yeah, so like you saw in Loving County, they used one county as one river, the Pecos River, as a way to do that. I'm not very well researched on that topic, but in the further west, I'm not too sure what all about that is, but yeah.
I think some of that relates to the population densities in the west, and the Texas legislature wanted to keep the counties as like about 900 square miles, so people could travel to the county seat within a single day. And so the Panhandle counties, you'll notice, are on a grid, and they're all roughly about the same size. But when you get west, you have those lower population densities. So if you look at some of the older maps, some of the big counties today, like Brewster, for example, were subdivided into multiple counties, and they found that they really couldn't administer government because of the population density, so they combined them into the larger counties.
Yeah, can you back up to the slide that showed the modern counties of West Texas?
Modern counties of West Texas? Yep.
Okay, yeah, that one. Okay, you'll notice all those big counties west between the Rio Grande and the Pecos River. The best map I ever saw was, you notice there's a weird triangular intersection there, kind of in the middle of the upper half. Those big counties up from there.
Right.
Yeah, that one, yes. And I saw a map of 1870 something of Texas, and there were only 3 counties west of the Pecos.
Oh.
So what's now El Paso, Hudspeth, and Culberson County was all El Paso County. What's now Reeves, Pecos, and Terrell County was all Pecos County. And that's why the city of Pecos is not in Pecos County anymore. It's now in Reeves County. And then it was Jeff Davis, Presidio, and Brewster were all Presidio County. And the county seat was actually in Presidio. And it was there until the Mexican Revolution happened. And then they moved it farther from the border and up to the railroad at Marfa.
Cool. Okay. Yeah.
Stole the courthouse and visited Tampa.
A comment, Jadon, you mentioned, when railroads came in, then mapping became more important, and they apparently did a pretty good job. So when oil and gas was discovered, there wasn't a lot of adjustments that had to be made to the mapping. I think that's evident when we look at the progression of maps of West Texas, particularly in the 1800s, and then when that railroad is built from Dallas-Fort Worth through West Texas to El Paso, we then begin to see maps that are very accurate and look pretty much like they look today.
Yeah, the railroads led to the establishment of the elevation grid in West Texas. I mean, you could see where the boundaries were before, but you couldn't tell what the elevation changes were. Well, the railroad needed to know that to make sure their engines could pull the trains. So they did very accurate elevation measurements in the 1880s.
Right.
And we still use those along the railroads.
And just kind of add to Mike's point, there was a time, once the oil industry came along, that those imprecision of some of those early surveys left those vacancies. And if you could find a vacancy, you could file on it, and particularly with oil. I mean, that's the Landers Strip down there at Crane. Mr. Turner, that used to live here, was one of those guys that would go out and hunt and find those vacancies. Because then you could get the royalty off that. You had to give the state their little cut. And then after that, they really started trying to shape up some of those surveys so you didn't have any more of those vacancies.
Well, they changed the law, so if there was a vacancy, it was equally divided between the adjacent landowners.
Right.
You couldn't claim it.
Absolutely, but they did go back in, like I know in my work with university lands, they eventually went in and shored up those surveys every which way they could.
Mhm.
They went down those piles of rocks from the original surveys and took out GPS and made sure, because it was so lucrative.
Yeah, I bet. Anything else?
Why is Texas so big on maps? I needed to contribute something. Are there any other questions for Jadon? All right, thank you, Jadon.